within the water column and to aquatic life as well as the food chain.
Yeah, I hope in all of the extensive stakeholder work you've gone through, you've been able to dispel that sense on the part of some of our friends in the water supply community that don't have the other end of the spectrum, that there's not a difference.
I hope so too. We'll see on August 19th.
We'll find out.
Or this afternoon.
Right.
Okay. Another concern is solids, so sediment, turbidity, sand, and here we will join in on the trash talk. So here are some pictures that we took ourselves. On the very left, what you have is, that is water from groundwater supply well flushing. So you're going to see water like that when a groundwater supply well is either new, it's being developed, being rehabilitated, or they're turning on a supply well after it being out of commission for a while. So that is the first amount of water that comes out, and it's clearing all the sands and everything in that well in order to prep the aquifer to deliver the clean water, which then goes on into the system. The second picture is a routine discharge from a groundwater supply well that's called pump to waste. And when the pump kicks on at first, it does need to waste an initial amount which has some solids in it. It cannot go forward into the system unless those solids are wasted. The four pictures to the right are actually what you see being pushed into either storm drain or a receiving water, which is debris, sand, trash, and so forth. The last item, which is definitely not the least, in fact, this is one of our most important concerns, is erosion, scour, and hydromodification of our water bodies. So here we have a fire hydrant flushing in a more rural setting of a residential community. And so the district staff is doing everything right. You see that yellow hose, they're diffusing the flow. They have dechlorination tablets hooked up in the middle of the picture. You see those black sandbags, which is slowing down the flow to help with erosion. You still will have some minimal amounts of sediment being displaced as you have such great amounts of water going into nearby water bodies. So this is actually a good scenario. If we do not have those management practices in place, the situation with that water body and the sediment and the erosion would be much worse. So now I'll go through the draft permit package. As I mentioned, the first item is a draft resolution, and this is to grant an exception to water purveyors statewide. It does include the draft mitigated negative declaration for CEQA purposes. The second item is the draft statewide NPDES general permit to regulate these discharges. Now, we have an adoption meeting scheduled for September 23rd. These two items are listed as two separate agenda items. The board may go forward and adopt the resolution, which includes approving the mitigated negative declaration, without adopting the statewide order. But you cannot adopt the statewide order without adopting the resolution, because the order implements the resolution. So to touch on the draft resolution, this resolution provides an exception. It's an analogy to an exemption, an exception to having to meet California toxic rule requirements. This exception applies solely to discharges resulting from mandated activities that are required from the Safe Drinking Water Act and the California Health and Safety Code. And that's the Federal Safe Drinking Water Act. It accepts water purveyors from the California Toxics Rule requirements as they are implemented in our State Water Board State Implementation Policy and Ocean Plan. So we do have to follow the guidance of those two plans with this exception. It applies to priority pollutant criteria. The California Toxic Rule is the federal rule that lists 126 priority pollutants, and it provides criteria for it. In this sense, we're not giving a blanket exception to all priority pollutants. We identified the priority pollutants that have criteria that are more stringent than the current maximum contaminant levels, and which are required from our Division of Drinking Water drinking system permits.
Oh, so the maximum contaminant levels are the standards that the state sets
Correct.
that drinking water's got to meet. The exception is for toxicity under the California Toxics Rule that EPA set.
Correct, right. So those are primary and secondary maximum contaminant levels. I've included some examples. Okay, let's take copper. The state level maximum contaminant level is 1,000 micrograms per liter. But the California Toxic Rule criteria for protection of aquatic life ranges from 3.1 to approximately 13 micrograms per liter. This is a range because there's over a handful of heavy metals in the California Toxic Rule listing that is dependent on the ambient hardness. And so that's actually a calculation. But you could just see the magnitude of difference in how low the CTR criteria is. Now zinc, in fact I'm picking copper and zinc because those are two items that are sometimes added to drinking water supply for management of algae and so forth. So the MCL for zinc is 5,000 and the CTR will range from 81 to 120 micrograms per liter. Here's a really important exception, and this is for chlorine byproducts. So two chlorine byproducts are dichlorobromomethane and dibromochloromethane. The state establishes the maximum contaminant levels as a group of trihalomethanes, which are chlorine byproducts. And so the total trihalomethane maximum contaminant level is 80 milligrams per liter. The California Toxic Rule, for example, for these two constituents is extremely low. And it's at 0.56 and 0.41. This is one of the key factors that drove a lot of our wastewater treatment plants throughout the state to change from chlorine disinfection to ultraviolet light disinfection, is to remove the chlorine byproduct. But this is an example of the CTR criteria that water purveyors would not have to meet if they're provided the exception. As things are in place right now, those criteria are in place and they are required to meet them with their discharges to waters of the U.S. So now I'll touch on the draft statewide permit and the type of discharges. The permit applies to both planned discharges that qualify for the exception, and I'll go a little bit more into that, and emergency discharges. Okay, as the draft sits right now, it applies to raw, potable, and treated water that's discharged from a drinking water system to a water of the United States. We started this permit thinking that we wanted a permit for groundwater well discharges and then distribution systems. So we started with potable and treated water. And then came the question, well, what about raw water and transmission lines? So we added raw water. We went into description into the draft permit. This is an area of confusion. And so I won't be surprised at the many comments we get, and that we would be clarifying this as we go forward to basically state that this permit applies only to water from a system where the water is dedicated for drinking water. So it's all water that is within a drinking water system that ends up discharged due to mandatory requirements. So continuing on with this draft permit, a little more detail. So we have planned discharges. These are discharges that allow the water purveyor to put management practices in place before they occur. and they're either directly to the surface waters or they're routed through the storm drain system. So here are some examples. So here the operator had a chance to put in a diffuser to diffuse the velocity. Here they're able to set up a dechlorination drip system, set up some screens for debris, and have the person on hand to put down the sandbags as well as take out some of the debris. You'll notice throughout this presentation, the pictures, the management practices are very similar to what you see in construction sites to stop a lot of the silts and the solids from entering. We also included emergency discharges, and this is to give water purveyors some regulatory protection over those discharges they do not want happening, but they happen anyway. They just don't know when and where. And so in this case, the draft permit basically acknowledges that they will have these emergency discharges. They will be discharged through or to waters of the U.S., and they are being given regulatory coverage for those discharges.
Like what the entire nation watched at UCLA.
Exactly. So you don't only...
And all of us got asked questions about it, but every reporter we talked to.
Right.
For LA.
So you don't only have the water that is spewing out, you also have the water from the pipelines that has basically flooded up the trench that they need to work in. They need to dewater that construction trench. That's construction dewatering of drinking water. All right. So let's talk about the proposed enrollment to this draft permit. Who would be required to enroll? The draft permit states that all systems with 15 connections or more are required to enroll. As we started considering raw water, we realized we needed to add transmission systems. So transmission systems are also included. They typically deliver water to municipalities with the end user connections. So we need to provide more clarification for that. Dischargers that have multiple systems are required to enroll, but they may enroll under one permit for all their systems. Now, this is an area of a lot of contention. Not only at the stakeholder meetings, I've also had conversations with representatives from the Association of California Mutual Water Agencies, and also staff from the Division of Drinking Water have shared their concerns that that 15 connection threshold is too low for small communities. One of the questions I was asked at the very beginning of one of our long meetings was, why are you doing this now? We have a drought, we have our groundwater levels lowering, we're trying to help small communities seek funding, and the list went on. This is not a favorable time to adopt new permits, but this permit's going forward. So I'm pointing this out that this is an area of sensitivity you will probably hear today, and we will get comments. And we are very open to reconsidering this number. One thing to think about is that this is a new statewide permit. That's a pretty big step we're taking already. And so if we do want to raise the number of connections which are required to go into this draft permit and allow systems with less connections the option if they do want the regulatory coverage, that could be just as good of a first step when it comes to a new permit as keeping it down to the lower number. I do know we did go down to this lower number because there are regional boards concerned with those little trailer parks and communities that sit on the bank of creeks. Right, and they are just discharging this water, and they may not have the education, the knowledge to put down these management practices. Who would not have to enroll? Now I'm going to show you a list, and this is a result of working really closely with stakeholders, especially the Southern California stakeholders. Who would not be required to enroll? Water purveyors that are also municipal stormwater permittees. they already have their NPDES permit. Water purveyors that have an established agreement with a municipal separate stormwater system permittee. And this item also in the draft permit requires that the regional board concurs with that and is good with that agreement. A third category is water purveyors whose discharges do not enter waters of the U.S. And there are locations throughout the state that have water bodies, but the water does not make it to actual surface waters. And I actually confirmed this with one of our regional boards out of the Lahontan Regional Board, out in like the Victorville area and so forth. Water that is discharged per our regional board colleagues, they state that water does not make it to a surface water just because of the soil type, the topography, and so forth.
So that means they don't need an exemption from the California toxics rule? Is that the
It
reason?
means they don't need an NPDES permit.
Right.
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 Exactly. So we thought we would include this in to make it clear.
But that's, okay. It doesn't mean they're not discharging somewhere where their discharge is hurting aquatic life.
That's a good point. So
But this is an NPDES
and
permit.
this is an NPDES. So
Right,
if
that
it
may be
reaches
another day.
right, if it reaches a federal water or
Sorry, that's a WGR issue then.
yes.
All right.
Okay. Right. So this is
Okay.
for waters of the U.S.
In that regard, I mean, you've made provisions, I don't want to jump ahead, but for those type of scenarios, right? Or waste discharge requirements or that
Yes.
sort of thing. So,
Yes.
yeah. And okay.
Okay.
Good.
I'll go a little bit into that in a couple slides. And the last category who did not have to enroll are the water purveyors whose system-specific or water body-specific discharges require an individual regional board permit due to a TMDL.
Oh, so they might already need one because of so they might already have a permit that handles this.
Right,
In
and
addition to the MS4 permit.
Right. You see this a lot in Southern California where the groundwater will have constituents that
Right.
are a TMDL constituent. This draft
Okay.
permit is basically for approximately 80% of the discharges out there. We may get a little more. It is very difficult to write a permit for 100% of the
Yeah.
discharges.
Okay.
And we recognize this is an area where if we were to have a permit that could address TMDLs to this level, it would be too stringent for the majority of the discharges throughout the state. So we have that as an exception. Now, I want to point out that even though this is a non-stormwater NPDES permit, it
Right.
is a best management practice focus permit. That is how the pollutants are controlled. We're not looking to treatment. It's basically getting the crew out there, sweeping.
It's good housekeeping.
It's good housekeeping. What you see, the picture on the upper right, that's a fabric filter bag, and they insert that underneath the stormwater grate. So if you look at the picture on the lower left, that stormwater inlet has a filter bag in it, and it's secured further with those sandbags. So basically what I'm saying here is we're not looking to costly treatment. It's definitely what's out there, and what's out there existing and proven. So for distribution system flushing, you have a lot of common practices, diffusers and so forth, screens, and again, your personnel and their hard labor, as well as dechlorination. The way this permit is set up, we're not looking at chemical addition as dechlorination, as the only method for dechlorination, and I'll go further into that. But you could see here that district staff is out there and they're able to do grab samples and so forth. For groundwater supply wells, what you see here on the upper left is a Baker tank. And that's a huge tank in which when they start pumping out of the groundwater supply wells, that dirty water goes into the tank for it to be settled and so forth. Then It goes out that pipeline, and the demonstration where we were at, that water continues on to some overland flow through some rocks and gravel, and then overland to do further filtering. And for the picture on the right at the very top, there's the insertion of even more management practices. There's a fabric filter bag in there, along with those other bundles to continuing filter for turbidity. So basically what we're targeting with this permit, the only areas that we have left, in addition to best management practices to put final effluent limits, is for chlorine and for turbidity. For chlorine, we're identifying that those limits are solely for water treated with chlorine. One of those areas is superchlorinated discharges. This is water in which has high level of chlorine. It's used for sanitary and disinfection systems. And so because of the very high levels, we have that immediate concern of threat to aquatic life. We also have we're placing chlorine limits on direct discharges and discharges that are within 300 feet of a water body. So as we look at this flow, we are making the assumption that water that flows more than 300 feet has the opportunity to dechlorinate itself. Okay. We've also included turbidity limits. The turbidity limits are for the groundwater. Here I have the groundwater supply well pumped to waste, and I was just having a fuzzy head moment, and I didn't include also when you're developing wells and rehabbing wells, right? Right. Now, this slide is for you. Because you as a board have been promoting multiple uses, making sure we make the most of our precious water. So what I'm presenting here is how this permit is attempting to promote multiple uses of this water. I have up there, the first picture is basically a stamp over a drain that this drains to the ocean. So especially for Southern California, our coastal areas, there's a lot of resources that goes into pumping, transmitting, treating, distributing this water. And for it to go back into, for it to go into the ocean or into a stream, yes, we do need the flows in our stream, but if we could just make more use out of that water. So in this permit, we are categorizing multiple uses such as groundwater recharge, where the system goes into an existing stormwater basin, or maybe if folks can keep this in mind with new development, where discharge is routed to a low impact development feature or reuse. So as you see that middle picture, at the far upper right hand side, there's a red fire hydrant. And so when they're flushing that line, that water would just flow, go into that little curb inlet, and actually irrigate or go into the ground just through that simple change in the curb. We're not pushing this for existing systems. What we're doing here is trying to align this permit with our other stormwater permits. So then we also have the reuse if the water purveyor is able to capture it in a truck and use that water for other purposes that augments our water supply. The incentive here is for any portions of the water that is put to multiple use or reuse, is that coverage under this permit serves as coverage as waste discharge requirements that they would not have to get from the regional board. This is an area where folks have asked, well, can we just have waste discharge requirements for all our discharges to land, whether it provides a beneficial use or not? And we did not include that in our draft permit. I'm sure we'll get comments. Another incentive is we have no monitoring for portions of discharges that do not go to waters of the U.S. So we're trying to provide incentives for just people to think this through a little bit, especially for new development. All right, so I mentioned cost of compliance. Our proposed monitoring and reporting requirements is the area that we, as permit writers, are continuously asking ourselves, are we getting value for the information that we're requiring? The first feature in our monitoring requirements is that it is field monitoring only. There is no laboratory analysis. The only exception for that is an application package for a discharge into a TMDL water body. We do require in the draft 2 lab samples of the TMDL specific pollutants. Otherwise, this is a big change from a lot of the regional permits we have out there that do require lab analysis.
That just is going on an assumption, that's going on an assumption that they're meeting their MCLs and we know what's in their water.
That is going on the assumption that these systems have a drinking water system permit from
So that
the
should
drinking
tell us
water
what's in
program.
their water.
Correct. And what we're concerned about is not only maybe chlorine of what's in their water, but what their water also pushes out and into the water body, which you could see are more physical parameters. So we believe just with in-field chlorine meters and turbidity meters, we can get the information we need to see if our water bodies are protected for the most part. We have event monitoring. What that is monitoring that we're requiring every time an event takes place.
So they have to record keep what they did.
Yes.
We put down the filter, we put down the bag, we put on the diffuser.
They either record keep it or they have their own best management plan, practices plan in place, which all their staff is trained to do and so forth, right? For event monitoring, this is monitoring that must take place every time the event takes place. This is an area that I know we will get some good comments. One of the events that we specify is direct discharges. And as we look more into the detail of how systems operate, that would mean monitoring for a lot of repetitive discharges. We are not looking for that. Event monitoring also means monitoring for large volume flows. And at this time, we have 1 acre foot or larger. In working with some of our regional board staff, such as our Region 2, they've asked if we can include superchlorinated water discharges as an event, which makes sense. And we're getting input from lots of other folks in this area. This permit includes representative monitoring. That means monitoring that you do once in one location of your system, and it represents discharges that's basically the same quality water that goes through the same type of management practices. And that type of monitoring is once per year. One thing that we may want to consider is including that the water purveyors use any data they collect for their drinking water permits, such as pH and stuff. They can use that same data if it represents what's actually going into the surface water. Okay. We only have receiving water monitoring for direct discharges that are non-compliant with the permit. And the receiving water monitoring we have is visual receiving water monitoring. So we are not requiring water purveyors that discharge in areas far away and out of their service areas to go to the receiving water and monitor. We think we're fine with this, especially for those that discharge into MS4 systems, because you have your MS4 permittee monitoring, and if there is a problem, I'm sure the MS4 permittee is looking at who's discharging into their systems. We do not place monitoring for emergency discharges or non-surface water discharges, as I mentioned. Did you have a question?
I do,
Uh-huh.
because you said you assume that an MS4 permittee would know what is being discharged into their system. Now, are we sure about that?
So I said we assume that the MS4 permittee is monitoring the receiving water, and if there's problems with the receiving water in which the whole system is discharging to, they will be looking into whom is discharging, what's causing the problem.
But will we be giving the MS4 will the regional boards be giving the MS4 some sort of citation for going beyond their permit limit because someone else discharged into their system?
So let me see if I can
Okay.
jump in and make it a little clearer. First off, we don't have, we have, in our MS4s, we have a general requirement to meet receiving water limits within the receiving water. The proposition that we have with this permit is that these are, in general terms, a limited amount of water for a short duration. So we're not impacting, causing a continuous discharge that would be assumed to cause a problem in the receiving water. That's why we only identify turbidity and chlorine as the chemicals of concern, and we're giving an exemption to the SIP. Because they are a small volume in the general, in a overall sense of the term. Any one discharge seems like a lot for a moment, but it's short term and it ends. And so that's the primary reason for not including receiving water limits in this.
To add on that, we heard about the reality of what goes on out there when you have an operator that's working for a city and they're discharging into a storm drain that drains into a receiving water that is they may not have access to, especially in that time. So just thinking about the logistics of when you discharge and how does an operator get to the receiving water. It gets much more complicated down in Southern California where a lot of your receiving waters are underground in the metropolitan area and so forth. And so when you think through the details, how do you actually do it, that's where it gets more difficult. So we've confined it to direct discharges. Okay. So as I mentioned, no monitoring for emergency discharges or non-surface water discharges. We are placing annual reporting to the state board. For coverage under this permit, all reports come straight to us, and it would be my staff that would be entering the information into our statewide database. Lots of the regional permits out there are requiring quarterly reporting. So if this permit goes in place with this annual reporting, it'll be cutting out a lot of the costs of that reporting. Now, this permit also requires reporting of non-compliance. And so we're kind of mimicking what we're doing with the sanitary sewer system statewide permit. So again, reporting of non-compliance, and it's not only non-compliance, but when there's a potential adverse impact to beneficial uses. We don't want folks reporting if they found the chlorine level higher and then they had to re-dechlorinate and they have the monitoring that shows they were out of compliance. So we're thinking this through. We're also requiring pre-notification of discharges 1 acre-foot or greater. That pre-notification is to the regional boards to give the regional boards the opportunity to decide if they want to send staff out there or just for them to know that it's taking place. And then we have post-notification of emergency discharges that after the fact they would notify the regional boards. Cost is one of those areas that folks are concerned about, especially the water purveyors that do not have management practices in place. The cost varies, and it varies from due to size, geographic location, staffing levels, and the current BMPs that are implemented. Eileen here has been doing a lot of cost research, and she's been contacting districts and getting actual costs. Here's an example. The average cost to acquire the field monitoring equipment for a 5-year life of a permit, we're looking at the chlorometers, which are approximately $300 a piece. A pH meter is approximately $800. A turbidity meter is approximately $1,000. We think, well, this equipment would last hopefully 5 years. We divide it by 5. That's the cost of having one set of equipment. This does not include staff costs, training costs, and so forth. Okay? And we can go more into cost research as we deem necessary. Okay, so with this, we're also working close with our Division of Administrative Service staff to put together a draft fee schedule. That is a separate process, even though we have folks that are very concerned about fees. And David Ceccarelli was telling us they're planning to release that in early August. We are in early August, so it's going to be any day now. We are proposing some kind of tiered fee schedule. We want to be sensitive to the cost of small communities. We want to be sensitive to other costs that systems have, like their drinking water permit fees, water right permit fees, and others. At this time, if the fee schedule is not changed, there's a fixed cost of $2,062 per year. That's the current fee for discharges that are low in threat and low in complexity and require no treatment. And water purveyors here may participate in that public process. So on July 3rd, we issued out a revised draft, and that was to include language that implements total maximum daily loads. Section K in the fact sheet summarizes the existing TMDLs that Renan, after he's gone through all the staff reports and everything for each TMDLs, has identified which apply to water purveyors. We've also had the assistance of the regional boards. We have had comments that why are you focusing only on Los Angeles and San Diego? So after getting feedback from our regional boards and going through the TMDLs, the Los Angeles and San Diego regions are those that have TMDLs that either directly or indirectly provide waste load allocations and identify water purveyors. It's solely those two regions. We've done this evaluation and we've concluded, because these discharges are intermittent, they're seasonal and so forth, that water purveyors are not a source of the pollutant impairment, that these discharges are unlikely to contribute to the impairment, and that establishing additional requirements like a numeric effluent limitation or further monitoring and treatment to these discharges will not improve the impairment. Now keep in mind, we're looking to capture approximately 80% of these discharges. There are going to be those that the regional boards do believe that groundwater that's being discharged, so forth, is contributing, and that will have to be addressed through a permit outside of this statewide permit. So our proposed transitions, we will, if and when adopted, the statewide permit will take the place of other low-threat type regional permits. Right now, we have the date of December 1st, which is the due date for all permit applications. The permit application is called the notice of intent. That's a standard term. We also are requiring notice of non-applicability to be submitted. The only way as staff that we can identify who needs a permit but is ducking underneath the radar until we find them is by having all water systems required to enroll to submit something. It's either an application for enrollment or it's a notice that this permit doesn't apply to us. We have a local agreement, we don't discharge to surface water, and so forth. We're trying to link that tracking system with the drinking water permit number, and now that we have that database, it would be fairly easy to do if we have everyone responding in some way. So the permit is requiring a notice that all systems come forth and submit something. As we get the application packages, the Deputy Director of Water Quality will be either issuing out an approval notice or a letter on what further information is needed to make the package complete before she issues out her approval notice. In that approval notice, it's called a Notice of Applicability. That is where we can identify termination of any existing permit coverage that that water purveyor has with a regional board. As I read my own words there and says termination of any existing permits, it's termination of any existing permit coverage, because you will have regional board permits that water purveyors still need to keep for other type discharges. As drafted in the permit, it gives 1 year after the adoption date for before the state board deems that those other regional permits are no longer effective to regulate these type of discharges. So where are we in the process? We've developed our draft documents and we're here today at the hearing. Our public comment period ends in 2 weeks. As we go forward, we'd be issuing a revised draft package based on any changes would be from public comments 10 days before the September 23rd board meeting. So that places us around September 12th. We do have a lot of concern from folks that that doesn't give enough time for them to re-review a permit that may have a lot of changes. I've went over most of the areas of the permit where folks have concern. Now I think it's time to hear from them, and I'd be happy, or we'd be happy to provide you more input as necessary.
Thank you very much for that overview. Great. All right. Fill out a blue speaker card if you haven't already and you'd like to speak. And there's one more coming. Thanks, Chris. What? Okay. Great. First, we have Pat Ryan from the Modesto Irrigation District.
Good afternoon, and again, Pat Ryan from MID, Modesto Irrigation District.
Try for 3. I've been generous, sorry. They were asking me 3 or 5. I'm going to say 3,
Okay.
but I'm not going to cut. As you notice, it's sort of, we really do want to hear from you, but I found that 3 people can summarize their points, and then we end up asking a lot of questions. So.
Okay. So first, I'd like to thank the board for giving me this opportunity to address them. I'd like to thank Diana and her staff for holding the workshops and engaging the end users and trying to find out, you know, where the problems are with this permit and how it can be made better for the folks that are going to have to apply it out in the field. Generally, I am supportive of the initiative that staff and the board is undertaking. Just a few comments that I'd like you to consider is, first of all, I'd like to have it cleared up in the permit that wholesalers are covered under this permit.
Okay.
In some sections of it, it seems clear. In other sections, it seems silent on it. So
Yeah, it
if there
wouldn't
was,
make any sense to not.
right.
Right.
So if it is, there can be consistency.
Sometimes it does make sense to take wholesalers out, which we did in something else, but for this, it doesn't.
Right.
Right.
Okay. I would also like to see under beneficial uses in section 6, adding irrigated acreage for ag land to the beneficial uses. You know, in unprecedented drought conditions that we're currently under, every water drop, every molecule is important, and if it can find some beneficial use out on ag land, then I think that should be covered under that. I would like to see if, you know, some type of de minimis amount where you don't have to do anything, whether it's a volume amount or a concentration amount, some combination of volume and concentration together that gives you a numeric milligram number or whatever it is. But it seems like there's, you know, a lot of, with most systems, there are some pretty small discharges, 100 gallons or less, that it doesn't seem like it's really worthwhile to be chasing after those and figuring out what's going on. It's kind of a minimal benefit from that. And I'd like to recognize that And also going back to the irrigation canals issue is that the water in the canal would serve as a dechlorination agent. In particular, if it's a lined irrigation canal, there's not going to be the aquatic life in it. And traveling down that canal just a few hundred feet, any chlorine that may be in the water is going to dissipate long before it could ever get to any type of receiving body if there is outfalls from those canals. And then also to recognize that private property would be exempt. Again, an irrigation canal is a perfect example where if you're discharging into it, this is the district operating its domestic water system, discharging into its irrigation canal system, and it's all part of the operation of one utility. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you. Helpful. All right, I have Adam Walukowicz from the Association from ACWA, Association of California Water Agencies, followed by Lori Schechtel from San Francisco Public Utilities Commission.
Good afternoon, board members. Madam Chair, thank you for this opportunity to comment. I'm Adam Walukewicz. I'm a regulatory advocate with the Association of California Water Agencies. We appreciate this opportunity to comment on the draft permit. As you may know, ACWA has 430 public agency members. Many of our member agencies are responsible for providing drinking water to the public, and as currently drafted, this permit affects every single one of those agencies. Given time constraints, I'm going to focus my comments today on two overarching areas of concern with the permit, the scope of coverage provided under the permit and issues associated with the cost of compliance. On that first issue, the scope of coverage, I'm going to limit my comments to just a single point today, and that is we'd urge the board to clearly identify the authority under which they can require non-dischargers to submit a notice of non-applicability under this permit. As you all know, as you may know, there's one other permit that the state has developed that requires dischargers to submit a notice of non-applicability. That's the industrial general permit. That provision in that permit is rooted in statutory authority that the state legislature created in the Stormwater Enforcement Act of 1998. To my knowledge, it's not typical that notices of non-applicability would be required for NPDES permits, so some clarity on that point would be very much appreciated.
What's the problem with it?
Well, again, we're looking for clarity on exactly what authority the board has to require a notice of
No, but why do you
non-applicability.
care?
I think we
Because
care
you would
because
rather we chase after everybody? I mean, there has to be a reason. I just want to understand it.
absolutely. I think one of the major cost concerns associated with this permit is for water agencies that aren't sure if they're discharging to a water of the U.S., that believe they're not discharging to a water of the U.S., or for all parts of their system, they're not sure. We think the typical NPDES permitting approach where permittees apply for a permit where they know they need coverage, work with regional boards or state board staff to determine if they need coverage, if there are questions, is appropriate rather than requiring all public water systems down to 15 connections to submit something. On cost, I think you'll hear from water agencies in the audience today that there are a number of cost concerns. Many of them are related to Clean Water Act jurisdictional issues. Other may be related to monitoring requirements, such as already been mentioned, the lack of a minimum threshold for certain types of discharges for the monitoring requirements to kick in. But I'll just, I think, kind of emphasize a theme in my comment today, which is that we'd encourage board staff to work with Division of Water, Drinking Water staff to identify areas where there's potential overlap between programs. The idea there is that water systems already do extensive monitoring for purposes of assessing compliance with the Health and Safety Code and Safe Drinking Water Act requirements. And to the extent that efficiencies can be gained or costs can be saved by developing permit provisions that capture some of the synergies that were emphasized in the administration's Drinking Water Program Transition Plan, we'd certainly encourage any efforts in that regard. A final point on process, as staff outlined, the comment deadline for this permit closes on August 19th. The adoption hearing is currently scheduled for September 23rd. Staff have indicated that they'll be releasing a draft permit no later than September 13th. It's certainly our feeling that based on what we heard at the workshops and the concerns we've heard articulated by our water agency members, we'd like to see substantial changes made to this permit. A lot of times just clarifications. And depending on the scope of those changes in the next draft of the permit, 6 working days might not be a sufficient period of time to fully review it prior to adoption. So we'd encourage the board to look at potentially extending that out based on the changes that are made. Just a few final comments to wrap up. I'd like to really thank Diana Messina and DWQ staff for their willingness to engage with stakeholders on this permit. Following the release of the most recent draft of the permit in early July, Diana led and organized a series of workshops around the state to engage stakeholders directly. I feel like there was some really candid and productive discussion at those workshops, so we look forward to continuing to work with them and you all moving forward.
Thank you very much.
Thank
I
you.
think that's the intent of all the conversations, as well as some of the exceptions, but we'll keep looking at it.
I do have one question for Diana. What did the drinking water program recommend as the cutoff? If it's not 15, is it 16? Or
So it wasn't 16. Let me give you a brief, just a little brief overview on that. The staff from the Division of Drinking Water, their concern is the small systems. So it is that we're going down to 15 connections. With small systems, they rightfully so need to devote a lot of their staff resources to helping these systems to operate, to acquire funding, to deal with curtailments and so forth, and that it would be too much of an additional burden to put on these small systems for yet one more permit. They also have the concern that a permit that would regulate discharges may make system managers rethink of how often they flush and so forth.
Oh, and they don't want them to not flush.
And they don't want those water purveyors that are going somewhat above and beyond the requirements, and especially if they have an operation plan in place with our Division of Drinking Water, to actually back off
Yeah, that
from
makes
what they're
sense.
doing.
Absolutely.
So we definitely do not want this permit to be a disincentive for operations that our drinking water program wants them to continue doing. That's one thing. As we were brainstorming with Don Ortega from the Association of California Mutual Water Agencies, we started thinking of different options. One was raising the threshold. A second was including a volume threshold for de minimis, in which those thresholds would not have to get coverage under a permit. My concern back to them is, what can we do? Actually, can we reverse this? What can we do to assist the small communities but still provide them with a permit that gives them regulatory protection?
Because they want protection too.
Right. So we thought of different things. Even one option on the other end of the spectrum is raise it up to 3,000 connections. That's the threshold that at this time is requiring systems to start looking into their groundwater management plans and their whole management altogether. And so have it just start with a smaller step at 3,000
Wow.
and
That's
then require.
exciting, a lot of people.
That's definitely at the other spectrum. I do have concerns about going down to 15. I also have concerns about the continued threat to water quality you would still have with the small systems.
No, that's right. I mean, that's the kind of thing to hope that people will comment on. That would be helpful. Thank
Did I
you.
answer your question?
Yeah, that was illuminating.
That was, and I mean, I think at some point it was very appropriate for us to bring up the Division of Drinking Water, and I appreciated Mr. Wallachevich, or I don't know, Adam's comment,
Yeah.
about that, and I know Diana and Renan and staff are interested in the cost of compliance issues and exploring the opportunity of using data that is already furnished to DDW. As meeting the intent, of reporting out whatever it might be, if it's representative of what we're looking for. Were there any examples of that come to mind, in terms of what DDW collects? And I think we talked about it earlier, but it bears worth mentioning.
Yes, it does, and I can have Renan answer this, but I want to put a few words in first. Of course, DDW is requiring the drinking water parameters, pH, chlorine, and then other MCLs. One area of confusion with this permit is we dove into too much detail on whether your water meets MCLs or doesn't meet MCLs. And we don't need to do that in this permit because the Division of Drinking Water does that through their permits. What's awkward is that this permit is requiring the exact opposite of some of the parameters that the drinking water permit is. They are looking
sure.
at chlorine. Is there enough chlorine? If there's not enough chlorine, you have to flush. We're looking at chlorine as you have too much chlorine. So it's kind of where chlorine would not be one of those items because we're looking for them to dechlorinate. pH maybe, depending on what they do with their water and their management practices. So there is opportunity to think this through. Renan, can you think of anything else?
Just wanted to add the fact that we do have